The Invisible Man. In a small, fog-covered village deep in the English countryside, there was an old, decrepit inn known as the Coach and Horses. It was a place where the locals gathered to share stories and gossip, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. But one winter evening, a stranger arrived in the village, one who would shatter the peace and forever change the lives of those who called the village home. The stranger was tall, his frame hidden beneath layers of thick clothing. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, concealing every inch of his skin. Thick tinted glasses obscured his eyes, giving him a nearly otherworldly appearance. He carried a small trunk, worn and battered, with him, dragging it into the inn as he demanded a room. Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, was taken aback by the stranger's appearance, but she was not one to turn away paying customers. She led him to a room upstairs, where he immediately locked the door behind him. Days passed, and the mysterious man rarely left his room. He asked for his meals to be brought to him, and when Mrs. Hall obliged, she could hear him muttering to himself in a low, harsh voice. When she tried to peek inside, she saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of the man hunched over a desk, surrounded by strange apparatuses and bottles filled with coloured liquids. The villagers soon began to talk. Who was this man who had come to their village? Why did he keep himself hidden away, never showing his face? Rumours spread like wildfire. Some said he was a criminal on the run, others whispered that he was a mad scientist, conducting forbidden experiments. But none of them could have imagined the truth. One evening, as a heavy snowstorm raged outside, Mrs. Hall finally decided to confront the stranger. Gathering her courage, she knocked on his door, demanding to know what was going on. There was a long silence, and then, to her surprise, the door creaked open. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle. The man stood in the shadows, his face obscured as always. "What is it you want, Mrs. Hall?" he asked, his voice cold and emotionless. "I want to know who you are," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You've been here for weeks and no one knows anything about you. What are you hiding?" There was a pause, and then the man stepped forward, his gloved hand reaching up to remove his hat and scarf. Mrs. Hall gasped as she saw what lay beneath. Nothing. Where his face should have been, there was only empty space, as if he were a phantom. She stumbled back in horror as the man began to unwind the bandages that covered his head, revealing the terrible truth: he was invisible. "You wanted to know who I am," he said, his voice growing harsher. "I am a man of science, a man who has discovered the secrets of invisibility, but it has come at a terrible cost."
Mrs. Hall was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The Invisible Man continued, his voice filled with bitterness. "My name is Dr. Griffin. I was once a brilliant physicist, a man of great promise, but my obsession with power and control led me down a dark path. I discovered a formula that could bend light, making objects and people disappear from sight. But when I tested it on myself, I found that there was no way to reverse the process. I became invisible, a ghost in the world of the living." Tears welled in Mrs. Hall's eyes as she listened to the Invisible Man's tragic tale. "Why didn't you seek help?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Help?" Griffin laughed bitterly. "There is no help for someone like me. I have been cursed by my own ambition, doomed to live in the shadows, unseen and forgotten. I came here to escape, to find some semblance of peace. But now, even that has been taken from me." As the days passed, Dr. Griffin's behavior became more erratic. He grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that the villagers were conspiring against him. He lashed out at anyone who came near, his invisible hands leaving bruises and welts on those unfortunate enough to cross his path. The villagers, now terrified, avoided the inn, leaving Mrs. Hall alone to deal with the Invisible Man's growing madness. One night, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled high against the doors, Dr. Griffin finally snapped. He burst from his room, ranting and raving about power and revenge. Mrs. Hall, trembling with fear, could only watch as he stormed out of the inn and into the night, disappearing into the swirling snow. The village was left in a state of panic. Dr. Griffin was loose, a madman with the power to move unseen, to strike without warning. The villagers barricaded themselves in their homes, praying that the Invisible Man would not come for them. But the terror did not end. Reports began to trickle in from nearby villages of strange occurrences, doors that opened and closed on their own, objects that moved as if by some unseen force, and people who were attacked by an invisible assailant. Dr. Griffin had become a specter of fear, a ghostly figure who haunted the countryside, driven mad by his own invention. But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, the reports grew less frequent. The invisible man seemed to vanish from the world, his madness consuming him until there was nothing left. The villagers gradually returned to their normal lives, but the fear of the unseen never truly left them. Years later, long after the events had passed into legend, a group of travelers came across an old, tattered journal buried in the snow near the edge of the village. The pages were weathered and torn, but the writing inside was clear. It was the journal of Dr. Griffin, the invisible man. In it, he detailed his experiments, his descent into madness, and his final, desperate attempt to reverse the process that had condemned him. But the last entry in the journal was the most chilling of all. Written in shaky, and even handwriting, it read, "I am no longer human. I am a shadow, a wraith. The world has forgotten me, and soon I will forget myself. But I will not die. I cannot die. I am invisible." The travelers, unnerved by the journal's contents, left it where they found it, buried in the snow. And as they walked away, they could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was following them, just out of sight.